I moved into a small apartment in the city center at the end of fall. It was kind of an impulsive decision, I admit. My old house was way too big for me after the divorce, and the suffocating silence at night made me anxious. This new place, though simple, felt just right for a fresh start. The building was old, with narrow hallways and creaky floors, but it had its charm. According to Mr. Tom, the landlord, the unit above mine had been vacant for months. He was a chatty, gray-haired man who seemed to always be looking for an excuse to strike up a conversation. He mentioned that the previous tenant had moved out months ago and that no one else had shown interest. I actually thought that was a good thing. I needed peace and quiet. But the silence didn't last long. On my very first night, as I tried to settle into bed, I heard heavy footsteps in the apartment above. It wasn't just someone walking. It sounded like someone pacing back and forth restlessly. At first, I thought Mr. Tom must have been mistaken, and there was someone living there after all, or maybe someone was just checking out the place late at night. I tried to ignore it, pulling a pillow over my head and telling myself it was nothing. But on the second night, the noises returned, louder this time. It wasn't just walking. Something was being dragged. A long, scraping sound, like heavy furniture being pushed across the floor. The next morning, I caught Mr. Tom at the front desk while he was delivering the local paper. I asked him casually if someone had moved into the unit upstairs, trying not to sound paranoid. He chuckled and shook his head. "Nobody wants that place," he said, almost dismissively. When I asked why, he brushed it off, saying, "Maybe it's just because the building's so old." I didn't push him further, but the way he avoided eye contact stuck with me. Still, I tried to move on. Maybe it really was just the old building settling, I thought. That's common in older buildings, right? But that night, the sounds got even stranger. It wasn't just footsteps and furniture being dragged. I could swear I heard voices, muffled, low, like someone muttering or arguing with themselves. I couldn't make out words, but the tone was unsettling, erratic, and coming directly from above my bedroom. I barely slept and spent the few hours I did manage with the light on. When morning came, I decided enough was enough. I needed to see for myself. I went up to the third floor, took a deep breath, and knocked on the door of apartment 302. Nothing. No sound, no movement. I tried the doorknob, but it was locked. That should have reassured me, but it only made me more uneasy. Over the following days, the noises became a part of my nightly routine. Footsteps, heavy dragging sounds, and sometimes even faint thuds, like something heavy hitting the floor. I started losing real sleep, and the exhaustion was pushing me to the edge. I brought it up to Mr. Tom again, but this time, he seemed annoyed by my questions, as if he was trying to convince me I was imagining things. "It's just an old building," he said with a forced smile. But this wasn't creaking or settling. These were deliberate, human-made sounds. His insistence only fueled my suspicion. Then one night, it went too far. It was almost midnight when I heard the unmistakable sound of something being dragged directly above my bedroom. This time, it was different. It was heavier, continuous, like someone was moving a large piece of furniture, maybe a table or a couch. I froze in bed, a knot forming in my stomach. The sound echoed through the silence of the building, almost as if it was done intentionally to get my attention. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. My adrenaline was through the roof, but my curiosity won over my fear. That's it, I thought, slipping on my shoes. I climbed the stairs, determined to end the mystery once and for all. When I reached the third-floor hallway, the air felt colder than usual, like something was off. The dim light flickered intermittently, casting unsettling shadows on the walls. My heart was pounding so loudly, I could hear it in my ears. I walked to the door of apartment 302, and to my surprise, it was slightly ajar. I don't know if it was bravery or sheer stupidity, but I pushed the door open slowly, feeling the wood creak under my hand. Inside, it was completely dark, except for a faint beam of streetlight seeping through the dusty windows. The smell of mildew was strong, and the place was utterly empty, or almost. In the center of the room, directly above where my bedroom would be, was a single chair. It was old, with worn wood and scratches on the legs, as if it had been dragged across the apartment countless times. But what truly froze me in place was the floor around the chair. It was marked with deep, erratic drag lines, going in circles and stopping abruptly in random places. The scratches were so deep that the wooden floor seemed gouged with an unnatural force. Hesitant, I stepped closer, and that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The chair was positioned directly over the spot where my bed was downstairs. As I stared at the scene, an overwhelming sense of unease washed over me, like something invisible was watching. My instincts screamed for me to leave, but my legs felt rooted to the floor. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe Mr. Tom was hiding something, I thought. But who would drag a chair around like that? And why? None of it made sense. I decided to shine my phone's flashlight around the room, looking for any other clues. That's when I noticed something even more disturbing. Handprints, small and smudged, as if someone with dirty fingers had pressed against the walls near the chair. They were irregular and spaced out, but all of them pointed toward the chair. Terrified, I took a few steps back, my heart racing like never before. And then it happened. A low sound, like a raspy sigh, echoed through the empty apartment. It came from behind me, in the hallway leading to the door. My breath caught, and every hair on my body stood on end. I turned slowly, my flashlight shaking in my hand. There was nothing there, just the endless darkness of the corridor. But something felt wrong, deeply wrong. The air was heavier, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. Without another thought, I ran out of the apartment, down the stairs as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached my apartment, I slammed the door shut and locked every bolt. The silence inside felt more unnerving than the noises from before. I collapsed onto the couch, trying to catch my breath while my mind raced. What had I just witnessed? That couldn't have been real. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening to every little sound around me. But the unit above was eerily quiet. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me after all that stress, I tried convincing myself. But deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore what I had seen. The marks, the scratches, the sound. The next morning, I went straight to Mr. Tom's office. He looked surprised to see me so early, but didn't seem particularly concerned. I told him everything, every detail, and insisted he come check the apartment with me. At first he resisted, saying the place had been empty for months and that I must have misunderstood what I heard. But my persistence, or maybe my panicked state, finally convinced him. We went up together, and he unlocked the door with his key. The apartment was just as I had left it the night before, empty. The chair was still there, positioned in the center of the room, but the drag marks on the floor looked fainter, almost as if they were fading. He shook his head and gave me a look that mixed pity and skepticism. As he continued to inspect the apartment with obvious indifference, I couldn't shake the uneasiness growing inside me. Something about that chair still felt wrong, like it was the epicenter of everything strange happening. I decided to ask directly, "Are you absolutely sure no one's been in here? Did the last tenant leave anything weird behind?" Mr. Tom chuckled, as if my question was absurd. "I already told you, nobody's lived here since the last tenant moved out. And honestly," he hesitated for a moment before continuing, "she had some paranoid ideas about this place too." That stopped me in my tracks. "Paranoid? What kind of ideas?" I pressed. He hesitated again before finally muttering, "She said she heard things too." That revelation left me speechless. It was as if the pieces of a confusing puzzle were starting to fit together, but none of the answers made sense. I asked for more details, but he just shook his head, brushing it off as silly things from an overactive imagination. After he left, I decided to go back upstairs one last time, against all common sense. I stood at the doorway, staring into the empty apartment. The chair was still there, unmoving, but now it almost seemed to stare back at me, as if it had a presence of its own. The silence was so absolute it hurt my ears, until, without warning, the apartment door slammed shut behind me with a loud bang. I jumped, the sound echoing like a scream through the empty hallway. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I turned abruptly, staring at the closed door, but the hallway was empty. A cold breeze started circulating through the apartment, even though no windows were open. The chair, still motionless in the center of the room, seemed charged with something I couldn't explain, more than just an old piece of furniture. That's when I decided I had seen enough. I took 2 steps toward the door, but froze. The sound was back, that heavy, continuous dragging. Only this time, it was coming from inside the apartment. With my phone's flashlight trembling in my hand, I scanned the room and nearly dropped the device. The chair had moved. It was no longer in the center of the room, but slightly tilted, as if it had been pushed toward me. The dragging sound continued, but I couldn't see what was causing it. It was as though something invisible was shifting the floor beneath it. That was the last straw. I bolted out of the apartment, yanking the door open so hard it slammed against the wall. I didn't look back once as I raced down the stairs. When I reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me and started packing. Whatever was happening, I wasn't spending another night in that place. I spent the next few hours throwing whatever I could into bags and boxes, not caring about organization. Every little creak or noise in the building made me jump. The worst part was that the noises from upstairs didn't stop. Footsteps, dragging sounds, and even faint knocking, like a reminder that I wasn't alone. When the sun finally rose, I called a moving company and begged for an emergency service. Within hours, I was leaving the building, dropping off the keys at the front desk without a single glance back. A week later, I got a message from Mr. Tom. He asked if I wanted to pick up something I'd supposedly left behind. An old chair from the apartment upstairs. My blood ran cold reading that. I called him immediately, trying to make sense of it. He said that when he went to check the apartment, he found the same chair back in the middle of the room, as though someone had deliberately placed it there again. "I thought it was yours," he said casually. But there was something different in his tone, a mix of worry and relief, as if he too wanted to stay as far away from it as possible. I told him to donate it or throw it out, but I never asked what he did with it. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that apartment. The chair, the noises, the constant feeling of being watched. It all felt so real, so deliberate. I don't know if it was something trapped in that place or just a manifestation of fear and isolation. But one thing's for sure, I've never moved into another old building, and I've never ignored my instincts again. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, hearing that dragging sound from above, even though I know there's nothing there anymore. Back then, I actually enjoyed the solitude. The quiet gave me time to think and listen to music while I killed time restocking shelves or checking inventory. It was a lonely but predictable routine. At least it was, until the car started showing up. It was a Tuesday night when I noticed it for the first time. An old navy blue sedan pulled into the lot a little after 2 a.m. Nothing strange about that. Drivers sometimes stop to use the restroom or grab a snack. But this car didn't pull up to the pumps, and no one got out. It just sat there, parked across the lot, headlights off. I didn't think much of it at the time. I went back to what I was doing, reorganizing the snack aisle, and when I looked again, the car was gone. I figured it was someone tired, taking a break from driving. But then it happened again 2 days later, and again the following week. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was someone working a late-night job, waiting for a ride or something. But the more the car appeared, the harder it was to ignore. The pattern was always the same. It would arrive between 2 and 3 a.m., park in the same spot, and sit there, motionless. I couldn't see much inside because of the darkness and the glare on the windows, but I knew someone was in there. Sometimes I'd try to act like it didn't bother me, continuing my routine, but it was impossible to ignore the feeling of being watched. Whoever was inside didn't do anything, just stared. The strangest part was that I never saw the car leave. Whenever I glanced away or got distracted, it just vanished. By the fifth or sixth time, I decided I had to do something. I walked to the glass doors and, summoning all the courage I could, stared directly at the car. I raised a hand to wave, hoping for some kind of response. Nothing. No movement. Just that eerie, suffocating silence. I grabbed the phone on the counter, ready to call the police, but as soon as I started dialing, the car's headlights flicked on and it sped off before I could press the call button. That was enough to leave me shaken. Why would someone do that? I convinced myself it was just some weirdo who didn't like being confronted. But the feeling of being watched lingered. Even on nights when the car didn't show up, I found myself staring at the entrance, waiting for it to return. A few weeks went by, and although the car didn't appear every night, I was paranoid. It was hard to focus on work, and every time I saw headlights coming down the road, my heart would race. I hated to admit it, but it was messing with my head. Around the third week, the pattern changed. It was nearly 3:30 a.m. when I heard a soft noise, a muffled sound of something being pressed against the glass door. When I approached, I saw a piece of paper taped to the outside, held by scuffed duct tape. The car was already gone. My first thought was that it was some kind of prank, but when I grabbed the note, a chill ran down my spine. Written in uneven, cramped handwriting, it said, "I know you see me." At that moment, it felt like the floor had disappeared beneath me. What did they mean? "I know you see me." Who would do something like this? I rushed outside, looking for any sign of the car or someone nearby, but the road was completely empty. The cold night air felt heavier than usual, like something invisible was watching me. I went back inside, hands shaking, and stuffed the note into the counter drawer. I tried convincing myself it was just a coincidence, that maybe the note wasn't even meant for me, but my mind kept replaying the words. The tone wasn't overtly threatening, but the sense of invasion, of someone knowing exactly where I was and what I was doing, was suffocating. I spent the rest of the night on edge, barely able to breathe. Over the next few nights, it became clear I wasn't just dealing with coincidences. More notes started to appear, always after the car had vanished. They were short but disturbingly specific, like the person knew intimate details about me. One read, "You always glance left when you're scared." Another mentioned the song playing on the store's radio. Good choice, but change the station at 2:15. It became a twisted game, and I felt increasingly exposed. I thought about quitting, but I was afraid of sounding crazy. Who would believe me? My manager rarely showed up, and the day shift coworkers always joked that night shift stories were exaggerated. But I knew this was real. Someone was watching me, and it wasn't by accident. The worst note arrived on a rainy night. The store was completely empty, and I was already exhausted from feeling on edge all the time. When I came back from the restroom, there it was, another piece of paper taped to the same spot. My breath caught in my throat when I read it. "Don't look behind you." Instinctively, I froze. Every part of me wanted to turn around, but something told me that if I did, things would escalate. I stayed still for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my ears. Finally, I mustered the courage to turn, but there was nothing there. No car, no person. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, had been there. That night, I barely made it through my shift. After that night, my relationship with the job completely changed. I no longer saw the store as a safe, familiar place. Every sound, every shadow felt like a threat. I tried telling my manager about the notes, but she brushed it off, suggesting I stop watching so many horror movies. With no other options, I started keeping a notebook, writing down every detail. The times the car appeared, the contents of the notes, even the songs playing on the radio. I hoped to find some kind of pattern, something that would make sense of it all. But the more I analyzed, the less it added up. The notes felt like they were written by someone who knew me better than anyone had a right to. The breaking point came on a Friday night. It was just before 3 a.m., and I was already on edge, fighting exhaustion and dread. The car showed up again, but this time, it didn't stay parked. It pulled closer to the store, headlights off, and the driver's door opened slowly. I couldn't see who got out, only a short, wiry silhouette that disappeared into the darkness before I could react. My first instinct was to lock the store doors, but as I moved toward them, I heard a noise above me, on the roof. My heart raced, and the only thought in my mind was, "This is it." I grabbed my phone to call the police, but before I could dial, the power went out, plunging the store into total darkness. Being in pitch-black darkness was worse than I'd imagined. My own heartbeat felt louder than anything around me. The only light was from my phone, which I clutched so tightly my hands shook. I tried to calm myself with deep breaths, but I couldn't ignore the sound of footsteps on the roof. Light, but deliberate. Whoever it was knew exactly what they were doing. My gut told me to stay quiet, but adrenaline took over. I sprinted to the storage room, where I knew there was an old flashlight. When I turned it on, the weak beam of light did little to make me feel safer. Suddenly, a metallic clang shattered the silence, like something had been thrown against the front door. My mind went into overdrive. Could there be more than one person? I knew I had to get out of there, but the thought of opening the door and facing the unknown froze me in place. I decided the best option was to hide. I wedged myself between boxes of drinks and cleaning supplies in the storage room, trying to come up with a plan. That's when I noticed something even more terrifying. The footsteps were now inside the store. My whole body went cold. They were slow, deliberate, as if whoever it was wanted me to know they were there. My breathing was so heavy, I feared it would give me away. I covered my mouth with my hand, trying to muffle any sound, but my body was shaking so badly it was almost impossible to stay still. The footsteps got closer, echoing in the silence like a drumbeat. When they stopped, I knew the person was just outside the storage room door. A thin sliver of light under the door revealed a shadow passing by. It wasn't as tall as I'd imagined, but the movements were unnervingly precise, almost mechanical. I clutched the flashlight to my chest, debating whether to run or stay hidden. Before I could decide, the power suddenly came back on, breaking the silence with the hum of refrigerators. The sudden light didn't bring relief. It only made the store feel eerily normal, as if nothing had happened. When I finally worked up the courage to leave the storage room, the store was empty. Whoever had been inside was gone. But as I approached the counter, something caught my eye. A new note was taped to the monitor of the security cameras. In the same jagged handwriting, it read, "You finally heard me." I froze, staring at those words for what felt like forever, trying to make sense of them. I checked the camera footage, but all it showed was static during the time I'd been in the storage room. No one entering, no one leaving, just me. The weight of that note hit me hard. Whoever this was, they wanted me to know this wasn't over. That night, I went straight home, still reeling from everything that had happened. I couldn't sleep. The image of the note on the monitor and the sound of footsteps inside the store replayed in my mind. I seriously thought about quitting, and the next morning, my manager called to say the security system needed repairs and told me to take a day off. I used that time to talk to some coworkers who had worked the graveyard shift before, hoping to find out if anything similar had happened to them. One of them, an older guy named Joe, told me something that made my skin crawl. Years ago, a customer had gone missing from the gas station's parking lot. His car was found locked, abandoned, in the exact same spot where the blue sedan always parked. That was all I needed to never go back. I submitted my resignation that same day. But the story didn't end there. A few weeks later, I received a letter at my house. There was no return address, and the envelope was crumpled, as if it had been carried around for a long time. Inside was a single piece of paper with the same jagged handwriting as the notes. "I told you not to look behind you." My stomach dropped. How did they know where I lived? Since then, I've avoided driving at night and make a point never to be alone for too long. I don't know who or what was after me, but the feeling of being watched has never gone away. Even now, when I'm alone, I swear there's something, or someone, just outside, waiting for me to look back. And run off. I opened the door the first time, but no one was there. The hallway was empty, and the building's oppressive silence felt even heavier. Over the following weeks, the knocking became more frequent, always late at night around 11 p.m. I tried to ignore it, but it's hard to pretend nothing's wrong when you're jolted awake, heart racing, with a deep sense that something isn't right. On the fourth night, I was determined to catch whoever was messing with me. I sat on the couch with all the lights off, waiting. At 11:08 p.m., the knocking came again, quick, short, but louder this time. My heart was in my throat as I flung the door open, expecting to catch someone red-handed. But there was nothing. Just the dark hallway and the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. But this time, something was different. The door to the apartment across the hall, which I'd always seen shut and covered in dust, was slightly ajar. A chill ran down my spine, but I told myself it was just the wind. I closed my door quickly, trying to shake the growing unease. The next morning, I decided to ask the building's maintenance guy, Mark, about the apartment across the hall. Mark is an older man, a bit grumpy, who's been taking care of the place for years. When I asked about the unit, he made a strange face, like he was uncomfortable. "That place was rented out about 6 months ago," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "But no one ever moved in. I just see the rent being paid every month." Weird, huh? My mind started racing. Was someone squatting in there? Or maybe something worse? Mark tried to change the subject, but I pressed him. He assured me the keys were kept in the office and that no one could be in there. I left the conversation even more intrigued, and with a growing sense that I shouldn't let it go. That night, things escalated. I was in my bedroom trying to watch a movie but couldn't concentrate. Every little sound in the building felt amplified. Around 11 p.m., I heard a noise, not at my door this time, but coming from the apartment across the hall. It sounded like something heavy falling, followed by a slow dragging noise, like someone moving furniture, or something worse. I froze for a few seconds, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then I heard it. A laugh. Low, muffled, like someone was trying to keep it quiet, but clear enough to make my blood run cold. Whoever was in there didn't want to be found. I'd had enough. I grabbed my phone and called Mark. He answered, voice groggy, probably woken up by my call. I quickly explained what was happening and insisted someone needed to check the apartment. "That's impossible," he said, clearly annoyed. "The keys are with me, and no one could have gotten in there." But as he said this, I heard something in the hallway. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I opened my door a crack, and my heart nearly stopped. The door to the apartment across the hall was now wide open, revealing only darkness inside. Before I could say anything, Mark hung up, muttering something about meeting me in the morning. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting on the couch with my door locked and a kitchen knife in my hand. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, but every time I looked through the peephole, my stomach churned. There was no movement, but the door across the hall remained open. It felt like a black hole in the middle of the hallway, sucking away every ounce of courage I had. Around 3 a.m., the worst happened. I heard footsteps, but not in the hallway. They were coming from the ceiling, directly above my apartment. Slow, shuffling steps, circling above me. I live on the top floor. There shouldn't be anyone up there. When daylight came, I rushed to Mark's office as soon as it opened at 8 a.m. He looked irritated that I was there so early, but something in his expression had changed. He wouldn't meet my eyes, as if he knew something he didn't want to share. I told him about the noises, the open door, everything. He sighed and pulled out a keyring with a key that looked older than the building itself. "Let's just get this over with," he said, clearly uncomfortable. We went up to the 3rd floor together. As we approached the apartment, my heart raced. The door was still open, but now the hallway walls had dusty handprints on them, like someone had been leaning on them to move around. When we stepped inside the apartment, a strange smell hit us immediately. It was a mix of mold, damp earth, and something metallic, almost like blood. The place was empty, at least at first glance. There was no furniture, just the echo of our footsteps on the worn wooden floor. But the longer I looked, the more I noticed something was off. There were marks on the floor, like something heavy had been dragged recently. The walls were covered in dark stains, almost like mold, spreading in irregular patterns. "This wasn't here before," Mark muttered, almost to himself. He seemed more uneasy with every passing second, and so did I. It wasn't just the smell or the sight of the place. It was the overwhelming feeling that we were being watched. Suddenly, we heard a noise coming from the bedroom at the back of the apartment. A sharp thud, like someone hitting the door. Mark looked at me, visibly uneasy, but he stepped toward the sound, holding the key in his hand. He turned the doorknob slowly and pushed the door open, revealing what looked like an empty room. But it wasn't completely empty. In the center of the room, there was an old wooden chair and something hanging from the ceiling, like a makeshift rope. On the floor, a pile of torn papers was scattered, all covered in scribbles I couldn't understand. But the worst thing was the mirror in the corner of the room. It was turned to face the wall, but seemed to have been moved recently. My entire body shivered when I noticed dusty fingerprints on the glass. Mark didn't seem to want to touch anything, but I couldn't resist. I picked up one of the papers from the floor, trying to decipher what was written. Most of it was illegible, but a few words stood out. "Not alone. Open door. They come." The more I read, the stronger the feeling grew that we were invading something we shouldn't. Mark took a step back, glancing toward the bedroom door. "We should get out of here," he said, his voice tense, almost a whisper. I agreed, but something about the mirror drew me in. Against every instinct screaming at me to stop, I approached it and turned it to face forward. That's when I saw it. It wasn't my reflection. The image in the mirror showed the empty room, but with someone, or something, standing behind me. I spun around immediately, but there was nothing there. We left the apartment in a hurry, locking the door behind us. Mark was visibly shaken, muttering something about calling a professional to check the place. But I knew this wasn't something an electrician or plumber could fix. Before we parted ways, I insisted that the keys to the apartment be locked away and that no one go inside again. He agreed, but looked as confused as I felt. When I got back to my apartment, I thought the nightmare was over. But that night, at exactly 11 p.m., the knocking started again. This time, it wasn't on my door. It was coming from the walls. With each passing second, the sound grew louder and closer, as if something was moving inside the walls, trying to reach me. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just paranoia. I turned on the TV and cranked up the volume, but the knocking persisted, rhythmic and relentless. Then the lights began to flicker, casting shadows that seemed to move along the walls. A crushing heat gripped my chest, a mix of panic and helplessness. I grabbed my phone to call Mark again, but there was no signal. Even the Wi-Fi was dead. The building felt completely cut off from the outside world, and that oppressive sensation of being watched returned, stronger than ever. This time, I knew I wasn't alone. I started hearing whispers, faint but unmistakable, as if someone were speaking directly into my ear. Yet, when I looked, no one was there. With my heart pounding, I grabbed a flashlight and decided to leave the apartment. I know it sounds insane, but staying there was driving me to the edge. When I opened the door, I was met with a sight I'll never forget. The hallway looked different. The lights flickered, and a thin mist seemed to coat the floor. The door to the apartment across the hall was wide open again, but now a shrill noise was coming from inside, like a distorted cry or scream. My legs trembled as I approached. I knew it was a terrible idea, but something pulled me toward it, as if resistance was futile. As I reached the doorway, a blurry figure appeared in the darkness of the apartment. Its eyes glowed with a dull yellow light, and before I could react, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang that nearly knocked me over. I ran back to my apartment, my body shaking like never before. I locked the door and pushed a shelf against it, trying to create a barrier, even though I knew it wouldn't help much. The knocking in the walls grew more violent, accompanied by scratches that sounded like nails dragging across concrete. Amid all the chaos, I heard that muffled laughter again, this time clearly coming from inside my apartment. I spun around, shining the flashlight into every corner of the room, but nothing was there. Everything in me screamed to get out, but I couldn't move a muscle. That's when I noticed something written on the wall in what looked like dust or soot. You left the door open. The next morning, everything was quiet. The building was eerily silent, as if nothing had happened. I went to Mark's office to try and make sense of it all, but the room was empty. I asked other tenants, and what they told me made my stomach drop. Mark had retired months ago. No one knew who was taking care of the building now. I returned to my apartment, but couldn't stay there long. I moved out within a week, leaving most of my belongings behind. To this day, I don't know what that was or why it happened to me. All I know is that sometimes, when I'm alone and everything is too quiet, I can still hear those knocks, followed by that muffled laughter. And I always wonder, did I leave the door open again? I was determined to help, but that's when things started to get strange. Walking through the forest at night is never exactly comfortable, but that night felt worse. The trail, which I knew well, seemed different. I clearly remembered some fallen trees and a small stream crossing the path. But as I moved forward, these landmarks started disappearing. Still, the voice kept calling, though it was intermittent, like it was struggling to reach me. The word help sounded more urgent each time, and I wondered how someone could have gotten hold of such old and unreliable equipment. With every step, the sound grew closer, but the terrain began to confuse me. Suddenly, I passed through a section of the forest I was sure I'd already walked through. The trees were identical, with the same gnarled branches, as if I'd been walking in circles. I tried not to panic, but it wasn't easy. I looked back in the direction I thought I'd come from, but nothing looked familiar. My campfire should have been visible in the distance, but it was as if it had never existed. I pulled the radio out of my pocket and tried to respond to the transmission, but it had no microphone, only a receiver. So I kept walking. After what felt like hours, I came to a small valley I'd never seen before. The sound was clearer now, almost constant, and it was coming from a clearing among some dead trees. I approached slowly, feeling the tension build with every step. There, in the middle of the clearing, I found what seemed to be the source of the signal, an old, broken transmitter, covered in moss and almost unrecognizable, like it had been there for decades. I stood there for a while, trying to process what I was seeing. The transmitter was strange, heavy, made of rusted metal with worn-out buttons. It looked like something from another era, maybe the 60s or 70s. But what unsettled me the most was that it was still working. A red light blinked intermittently, in sync with the voice still calling out, "Help, please." None of it made sense. Who was speaking? And how was such old equipment transmitting such a clear signal? I crouched to take a closer look, searching for any clues about who might have left it there. But the ground around it was clean. There were no footprints or drag marks. It was as if it had just materialized there. At this point, I was feeling increasingly uneasy. The air around me felt heavier, denser, as if something unseen was watching me. When I stood up, I felt that unmistakable sensation of being observed. I scanned the area, looking for any sign of movement, but the clearing was completely still. Only the dead trees, with branches twisted like deformed arms, and the continuous sound of the transmitter broke the silence. I decided I'd had enough and needed to head back. But when I tried to retrace my steps, everything looked different. The trees I was sure I had passed now formed strange patterns. I walked for several minutes, convinced I was on the right path, only to find myself back at the same transmitter. It was as if it was pulling me back, no matter where I went. The panic was starting to set in. I looked in every direction, trying to find a familiar landmark, but everything around me seemed identical. It was like being stuck in a loop, and every time I tried to leave, I ended up back at that clearing. The transmitter kept emitting the same message, but now the voice sounded wrong. I can't explain it. It was still asking for help, but there was something different in its tone, like the urgency had been replaced by something almost mocking. I tried to ignore it and focus on getting out of there, marking the trees with the survival knife I always carry. I marked 5 or 6 trees before realizing that the marks disappeared as soon as I turned away. The feeling of being watched only grew worse. It was like something was circling me but never revealing itself. I started yelling, calling for help, but my voice seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the area, but all I saw were more twisted trees and shadows that didn't seem to belong. Then I heard it. Something other than the transmitter's voice. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and coming from multiple directions at once. My instincts screamed at me to run, but run where? I stood frozen, gripping the flashlight tightly as the footsteps grew closer and then stopped, like they were deciding what to do with me. The footsteps stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it echoed in the clearing. I tried to rationalize, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but it wasn't. This was real. I turned my attention back to the transmitter, thinking maybe it held some kind of clue, or a map, anything. But as I got closer again, the red light started blinking faster and the voice changed. This time, the message was clear. You shouldn't have come. A chill ran down my spine. It wasn't just some random transmission. It felt directed at me. The voice sounded almost human, but there was something deeply wrong with it, like it was trying to mimic someone speaking. I was about to kick that transmitter and bolt when something moved in the shadows of the trees around me. It was fast, so fast I almost thought I imagined it. But then I saw it again. A low, slender silhouette with jerky movements, like it wasn't used to walking. I don't know how to describe it exactly, but it looked more like a smear of darkness than anything solid. It didn't have a face, just a presence, and I swear I felt the air around me grow colder. My legs felt like jelly, but I managed to take a step back. As soon as I did, the thing mimicked my movement, stepping toward me. My mind went into full panic mode. All I wanted was to get out of there, but it felt like the forest had decided I wasn't leaving. Every step I took back, that thing moved forward, keeping the same distance between us. The transmitter kept emitting that horrible sound, its red light blinking like a warning. Then, something strange happened. I heard my own voice coming from the transmitter. It was an exact replay of what I'd yelled earlier. "Help! Is anyone there?" That's when I realized the whole thing was a trap. Whoever or whatever was behind this didn't need help. I was the target. Suddenly, the silhouette stopped, as if it was waiting for something. I took advantage of the pause and ran. I ran without looking back, ignoring the fact that the terrain seemed to shift beneath my feet. My boots sank into a ground that alternated between damp moss, dry leaves, and something that felt like smooth stone. My chest burned from the effort, and the flashlight shook in my hand, but I kept going. I passed trees that looked like towering shadows, each one more distorted than the last. Then I saw a light in the distance, faint but steady. I thought it might be my campfire, but as I got closer, I realized it was something completely different. The light was coming from a structure I hadn't seen before, a small cabin almost completely swallowed by the surrounding vegetation. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, but the light was flickering from what seemed to be a window with torn curtains. For some reason, I didn't feel relieved to see it. If anything, I felt more on edge. Still, staying in the forest wasn't an option. I approached slowly, trying to control my ragged breathing. When I reached the door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. The air coming from inside was cold and carried a strange smell, a mix of mildew and iron. I nudged the door open with my fingertips, and it creaked loudly, like it was resisting. The inside of the cabin was dark, lit only by the pulsating light of a bulb hanging from the ceiling. The furniture was scattered, covered in dust and cobwebs. But what caught my attention was the transmitter. Yes, another one, identical to the one in the clearing. It sat in the center of a table, its red light blinking in the same rhythm. I approached it hesitantly and saw something that made my blood run cold. The table was covered with maps and notes, all marking the area where I had been camping. Among the papers was a notebook filled with scribbled pages, but what terrified me most was a single phrase repeated over and over: "They are watching." My first instinct was to run out of that cabin, but my feet felt glued to the floor. I picked up the notebook with trembling hands, flipping through the pages while the light continued to flicker. The notes were chaotic, almost frantic, but some phrases stood out. "Don't trust the path. They change the terrain. The forest is alive." This was too much for my mind to handle. Who wrote this? And who were they? My heart felt like it was going to explode, but that's when I heard it again. Not the transmitter's voice, but something much closer. Breathing, heavy and slow, coming from the dark corner of the cabin. I turned my flashlight toward the corner and saw it. I can't fully describe what it was, but it had the same form I'd seen before in the forest. Only now it was standing still, watching me. The flashlight's beam didn't seem to affect it. It was like the light was absorbed, leaving only a smudge of darkness where it should have been. My body froze. Then, slowly, the thing took a step forward, the sound of something scraping against the floor echoing through the cabin. That's when I heard my own voice again, this time coming from the thing. "Help! Is anyone there?" It was my voice, but distorted, like it was mocking me. I knew there was no way I could fight it. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me to run, but my muscles wouldn't cooperate. The creature took another step forward, and then something unexpected happened. The transmitter on the table emitted a piercing sound, so loud and high-pitched it felt like it was vibrating inside my skull. The thing stopped. It twisted and contorted, like it was trying to escape the sound, and then, like a shadow dissolving at sunset, it vanished. Without wasting another second, I dropped the notebook and bolted out of the cabin, not daring to look back. I didn't care about the path anymore. I just wanted to get out. My flashlight started flickering, and the forest around me seemed to shift with every step, but I kept moving. After what felt like an eternity, I saw a familiar light in the distance. It was my campfire. I nearly collapsed with relief when I realized I'd finally made it back. But something still didn't add up. I looked up at the sky and noticed the moon was in the exact same position as when I'd left. It was as if no time had passed. The next morning, I packed up my things and left. I've never gone back to that place, and I still don't know what really happened that night. But ever since, even at home, I sometimes hear static coming from devices that aren't even turned on. And every now and then, through the static, I hear a voice whisper, "Help. Is anyone there?"